When people think of the birth of thrash metal, people think of the Bay Area scene in the early 80s, mostly Metallica and the album Kill 'Em All, as well as a few other bands that were active at that time. But did you know that a few years later there was this emerging thrash metal scene in the country of Canada? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about 5 bands who were active in mid to late 80s in Canada. We'll talk about their debut albums. So this is part of a series where I'm covering metal bands from other countries. This time I'm exploring the Canadian thrash metal scene of the 80s. First band I want to talk about is Razor, and they formed in 1983 in Ontario, Canada. Their debut album was released in April of 1985. It's called Executional Song. This is their first full-length album, but not their first release. Their first release was called Armed and Dangerous. It came out in 1984. But this is their full-length album, the Executional Song. It has 11 tracks. It's about 37 minutes long. The album opens with the track Take the Torch. The sound was similar to Metallica from their Kill 'Em All album, but I think this band Razor turned it up a notch. It was a little faster, a little more aggressive. The lyrics were typical of thrash. They were talking about how metal they were. There was a cool bass guitar intro, a blazing guitar solo, and the next track after that was called Fast and Loud, and that pretty much describes the song in its entirety. Even the lyrics talk about how they are a fast and loud metal band, but the next song is called City of Damnation. This was a little different. The lyrics describe this underground militia that operates within a city. I assume it's a fictional city. It's very fast-paced thrash metal and sounds a little bit like some of that blackened thrash that's popular today. The next song is called Escape the Fire, and it describes a world where everything is in complete anarchy. It's another pretty cool song with lots of speed and aggression. So far on this album, I haven't heard anything where they slowed it down, anything like that. I think the first song on the album where they slowed down a little bit was called Distant Thunder. That reminded me more along the lines of a Judas Priest. That was a pretty cool song. It sounded a bit more like traditional heavy metal. The rest of the album was mostly fast and heavy thrash metal. Another track that stood out was called Death Race, which I think might have been inspired by that movie that came out in the late 70s called Death Race 2000. I like the song. It's still fast-paced thrash metal, and it has really cool guitar riffs. They really stood out in that one. Overall, it's definitely a band you should check out. They released 7 albums between 1985 and 1991, so those would be their classic years. Then they released another one in 1997 called Decibels. I think I may have listened to that a few years ago. And they released a comeback album in 2022 called Cycle of Contempt. But I remember I didn't like that one that much because the production was pretty bad. But I remember checking out their early material because this band is really good. The next band I have is called Sacrifice, and they're from Toronto, Ontario. This band actually just released a new album called 6, and it's their 6th album. I am reviewing it, or I will review it depending on if this one comes out before or after my review of the new Sacrifice album. But this band released 4 albums between 1986 and 1993. Then they released a comeback album in 2009 called The Ones That Condemn. But this new one is 16 years after the last one, so definitely check out my review of the new one. But for this video, I want to focus on their debut album from 1986 called Torment in Fire, released on Metal Blade and Roadrunner. This was some thrash metal. It was some of that darker thrash metal with more along the lines of early Sodom and even Slayer. The lyrics addressed dark and occult themes. The opening track, The Awakening, sounded like they're doing some type of ritual and they're going to awaken the dead or something like that. And they just shred on the guitars. But the first real song is called Sacrifice, named after the band. And the lyrics actually describe the sacrifice where they're tying this person to an altar and then getting a dagger ready and all that kind of stuff. It's very fast, very dark, very evil sounding. Like I said, something like early Slayer, but pretty cool thrash metal. After this is a song called Turn in Your Grave. This one probably sounded closer to traditional heavy metal or even new wave of British heavy metal, but still fast and aggressive. I thought that was pretty good, and I like the intense drumming. After that, they had a song called Homicidal Breath. And this is where they slowed down a little bit, more of a mid-pace. Reminded me of something off of Slayer's Hell Awaits album, something along those lines. The rest of the album is more that fast and aggressive thrash metal. One thing I noticed, this band likes to play lots of blazing guitar solos. They come in and out of the song. And there was an instrumental called The Exorcism, which was very fast. I would even say bordering death metal. Definitely check out this band. Check out the new album. Check out their old albums. And the new review should be out pretty soon around this time or before this. So the next two bands I talk about are going to be some bigger name bands. But then after this, the fifth band I have is going to be something I discovered a few years ago. And they kind of surprised me. And it's a band that was like stuck. They were kind of stuck in the back of my head. I was like, remember them. But first, let me talk about some of the bigger bands. I want to talk about Voivod. Now, they're a big band. You know them. You know them for being a progressive metal band. And you could even call it that. Right now, like, Voivod has their own style. Like, no one else sounds like Voivod. They kind of made their own genre for themselves. But when they started out, they were part of the thrash metal scene. So I want to talk about their debut album. Now, this album is called War and Pain and released in September of 1984 on Metal Blade. The opening track is another one, a self-titled. It's called Voivod, and it's very raw sounding. It's fast-paced. The vocal is very harsh. It has this punk rock type of energy, but the chorus was pretty catchy. It's like a cross between Motorhead and Celtic Frost. That's what I got from it. And I like the lyrics. They're science fiction based. They're talking about some type of monster or something like that. And this album has Piggy on guitar, and he does lots of these short solos. And there's also lots of other good songs. So, for example, the next track, Warriors of Ice, had this Motorhead vibe with a cool drum and bass guitar intro that was very raw, with cool guitar riffs and powerful drumming, and a breakdown where they slowed down and changed the rhythm. Some of the guitar playing also really sounded ahead of its time. There was another track that stuck out called Suck Your Bone. It had more of those Motorhead-style riffs. And another track called Iron Gang, which sounded more like heavy punk rock. Then a track called War and Pain, or the title track. I like that one a lot because they slowed it down a little bit and did more of those galloping guitar riffs. I thought that was a standout. And then a track, Live for Violence. And that one, you start to hear traces of that progressive metal sound that they would begin to play on their future albums like Killing Technology and the ones. So overall, pretty cool. Personally, I like Voivod when they're more on their progressive side. My favorite albums are the ones from the late 80s, Killing Technology, all the way up to Outer Limits. But if you want to see what this band was like in the beginning, definitely check out their first two albums. Next, I have another big band, and they are Annihilator. They formed in 1984 by Jeff Waters. He's the only constant in the band, and they've changed members throughout the years. They have a large discography. They have 17 studio albums, but their debut is called Alice in Hell, and I believe it's their best album. It was released on April 17th, 1989. This has Randy Rampage on vocals, and he left the band after this album, then he came back 10 years later in 1999. I remember this band back in the day. I remember watching the music video for Alice in Hell on MTV's Headbangers Ball in the late 80s. It's a great album, thrash metal, but has lots of neoclassical playing on it. And I felt this band got a little repetitive and derivative over the years, so their later albums are probably not as great, but this is just a classic. So the album opens with an instrumental called Crystalline. It's less than 2 minutes long. It sounds like something you would hear on an Ozzy Osbourne album with Randy Rhoads, something like that. It's classical acoustic guitar piece, and it just sets the tone for the album, and it just really stands out. It has this dark and creepy vibe. And it has a cool intro, then it goes into the main song, Alice in Hell, which is a classic, and they spell it different. It's different spelling than the album, but it's another awesome thrash metal song with neoclassical influences, and that one has an awesome music video like I mentioned. And then they have a song WTYD, which stands for Welcome to Your Death. It's just straightforward thrash metal, very aggressive sounding. You got chugging riffs and awesome drumming. Then you have Wicked Mystic, and this is filled with speed and aggression, lots of chugging guitars, classic thrash metal riffs. But by the middle of the album, they have a track called Burns Like a Buzzsaw Blade, probably a little closer to that traditional heavy metal that's bordering on thrash. something along the lines of Metal Church, but that's an awesome track. And a track called Word Salad with a pretty cool intro, the clean guitars and the arpeggiated chords. That's something that bands, especially thrash bands, would do back in the day. And I like that one a lot. It has different tempo changes. And then another track, Human Incesticide, just full-on thrash assault, lots of speed and aggression. And that was the last song on the album. So it really ends on a high note. Overall, one of my favorite debut thrash metal albums of all time. This is counting all of them. I mean, this is going up against like Kill 'Em All or any thrash album. One of my favorite of all time. Like, this would rank very high. But before I go, I want to talk about one more band, and it's called Obliveon. It's one of the lesser known bands, and I think everyone should listen to them because they're really good. The band formed in 1987, and they spelled the name Oblivion the way it's normally spelled, but they found there was another band in the United States with the same name, so they basically kept the name, but they changed the spelling. They added an E in the middle, and I'll just put the spelling up here so you can see what I'm talking about. It's one of the first technical thrash metal bands. They went more progressive a little on later, but in other words, they were ahead of their time. They only released 4 albums. The one I want to talk about is their debut, called From This Day Forward. The album has 7 tracks. It's 39 minutes long, and when you hear the opening riff to the song, which is the title track, sounds very different. This is very technical, progressive metal music with groovy bass lines, and just sounds very cool. They're a lot different than other bands. The opening track is not very fast-paced, but has lots of thrash metal style guitar riffs and lots of changes in the song, as well as harsh vocals. There are other parts of the song where the bass guitar is the main instrument and the guitars are more in the background. Next track is called Fiction of Veracity. It's over 8.5 minutes long. Has this very trippy guitar intro. When you hear the bass guitar play the main riff in the background, you hear these sustained power chords, and then it goes more into a thrash metal song. I think the thing I like about this band is that they have this bass guitar mixed up high, and it plays a major role in all the songs, just as opposed to matching the guitars that other bands usually do. If you read the lyrics, they're about these futuristic science fiction types of things. A good comparison would be the band Vector, which is a newer band, but this band Oblivion is doing it back in 1990. And then the song after this is called Droidomized. And it sounded more like straightforward thrash, but it's a pretty cool song. I think it's like they're turning this person into a robot. I read the lyrics, I tried to interpret them. Another song called Imminent Regenerator has lots of tempo changes and technical guitar riffs, and they have long instrumental sections. And it just doesn't have any vocals until about 1.5 minutes. That's something this band also does. They have these long instrumental sections. And a track called It Should Have Stayed Unreal with arpeggiated clean guitars. And that's a cool song. It gets a little slow, but gets a little faster in the middle. Then the next song, Access to the Acropolis, begins with a cool isolated bass guitar solo, followed by melodic lead guitar playing. And that's also a 4-minute instrumental. So overall, I recommend you check out the band. I discovered them by chance. They appeared on this random playlist I found one day. And one of those bands that always stuck in my head because I've always liked it. That's all. Check out this video here about the heavy metal scene in France. That was from the early 80s as well. And they also have a connection to Anthrax. So you'll find out what I'm talking about when you watch that video. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Please give the video a like. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you're not already. I do rock and metal reviews. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.